Michael Myers has survived it all: car crashes, burning flames, gunshots, stabbings, the lot. But how is he still alive? Hi guys, my name's Barry and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be looking into every injury that Michael Myers has sustained that he probably shouldn't have survived if he was a basic human being. Now, the rules of this video are, I know that we have injuries within the movie world, like characters like John Wick, who can survive a lot more than the average human being outside of the movie world. And people like Vin Diesel, Dominic Toretto from the Fast and Furious franchise, those characters survive a lot of unsurvivable things. So we have to make sure that we've got that bar set with Michael Myers. He is in a horror movie franchise as well, so the average horror movie villain can survive a little bit more than the characters like John Wick. So I have to take that into consideration as well. So I'm going to look at some of the things that when these injuries happen to Michael, then it makes you question, is he human or is he something more than a human being? In Halloween 1 from 1978, surprisingly, there is only one part of the movie that makes you question whether Michael is human or more than human. Yes, he gets stabbed by a knitting needle. Yes, he's been stabbed by a knife, etc. But those are things that people in the general world can survive. So I'm not including those on the list. The only time he survives something that most likely you would die from would be getting shot 6 times and then falling off the balcony. That is questionable, but even when that happens, he disappears at the end of the movie. That makes you question whether he was human or not. And that's what was amazing about the first movie, because he did seem like a human being until that very point at the end of the movie. So props to John Carpenter for that, because only one time in the movie we questioned whether it was more than a human. In Halloween 2 from 1981, we got a similar vibe that we did in Halloween 1, and that is, it did seem human throughout the entire movie until the end, where two things happened this time. One, he was shot in the eyes, which you would probably die from because he was shot twice at almost point blank range, and after he gets shot in the eyes, he then started to burn to death. Obviously, if that was the end of the movie, then we would accept that a little bit more because he died from his injuries, but because he did come back in later movies, which we will discuss, then he's obviously more than a human because he survived something that most humans wouldn't survive. In Halloween 4 in 1988, it is confirmed that he survives his burns and the gunshot wounds at the end of Halloween 2. So straight away, we're already questioning what is happening here, because he survived something that you shouldn't survive as a normal human being. But it's quite similar, again, to the first two movies, in the sense that not a lot happens in the film for us to question whether he's a human or not, until, again, the very end of the movie, where the firing squad starts pumping him full of bullets and he falls into that mine shaft. That's basically the only part of this movie that makes you really question whether he's a human or more than a human, obviously apart from the events of Halloween 2. So when it comes to realism, Halloween 4 is quite realistic until the end of the movie. Next up, we've got Halloween 5 from 1989. And this is the point when I was looking into it that it seems to be, it's a realistic movie for Michael Myers most of the time. But what happens in the previous film carrying over to the next one is what makes Michael feel more than just a human being. So in this one, he is shot multiple times again, and that is something that most people would die from. But apart from that, there's not a lot in the movie that makes me think he's more than a human being. It's only because what happened in the previous film that is retconned to keep him alive in the next movie is what makes him more than a human. Next up, we've got Halloween, The Curse of Michael Myers from 1995. This is where we start to get into the more zombie-like Michael Myers, because he does sustain a lot more in this one, even in the movies moving forward, that you obviously question. And in this one, he gets pumped full of this chemicals. I don't know what chemicals it gets pumped with. This is obviously in the theatrical cut of the movie, where it gets pumped through with this stuff, and he still survives. And he obviously gets beaten up by Tommy with that pipe to the point where he probably would have disintegrated, and he still survives at the end of this movie. Halloween H2O from 1998 is where we go back to basics like Halloween 1. He is more of a human being in this one. He's nothing like the Curse of Michael Myers. So he's back to being more realistic, a more realistic Michael Myers that we got in the first movie. He is stabbed a few times by Laurie Strode, even with that axe as well, which again, if you were a normal human being, you would fall to the ground, but not Michael Myers. And then at the end of the movie, he gets knocked down by Laurie and he gets sandwiched between the van and a tree. Now, if that was a real person, they probably would have died from the injuries they sustained at that moment in time. But Michael being Michael, he survived that. And then, of course, he was decapitated at the end of the movie, which we'll discuss next. But before he was decapitated, the only thing in the film that you should definitely die from is being sandwiched between that tree and the van. Next up, we have Halloween Resurrection from 2002. Now, Michael, of course, comes back again. He didn't get decapitated. They completely retconned that from Halloween H2O. So that doesn't even count as Michael surviving a decapitation because ultimately it wasn't Michael Myers. In Resurrection, though, again, he's stabbed multiple times, which you can survive in the real world, especially in the movie world, like characters like John Wick that I mentioned. So I don't really want to include some stabs because ultimately you can, even in the real world, survive some stabbings. I think the only big thing that Michael survived that he shouldn't have was the electrocution at the end of the movie. So again, it still seems like he's surviving things in the movie or throughout the movie that you can survive. It's only when you get to the end of the movie where they kill him off, finally, and then it ends up coming back. But at least in Halloween Resurrection, after electrocution, we don't need to wait to the next movie because it doesn't exist. We see at the very end of the movie that he survives an electrocution, something that most people would die from. Next up, we've got Rob Zombie's Halloween from 2007, the remake. So we can forget the Resurrection timeline, that no longer exists anymore. We're on to the new remake timeline. Now, I have to hand it to Rob Zombie because, let's just give him a little clap. At not one point in this entire movie did Michael sustain any injuries that a normal human being of Michael's size would die from. I can't think of anything. The only thing that we can think of is the very end of the movie. But if we assumed that that was the end and there wasn't a sequel, then Michael Myers was completely human. There was nothing in this movie that I thought he would die from that. Especially a man at almost 7 feet tall, he would die from that. There's nothing. So I have to hand it to Rob Zombie. There's nothing. When we move on to Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 from 2009, all of that from Halloween 1 that was kind of perfect in the sense that Michael was a human, it was all messed up because Michael was clearly shot in the face at the end of Halloween 1 that ended it perfectly, but because they brought him back and he didn't really look like he had injuries to his face, then he's more than a human being, unfortunately. So that kind of messed up Rob Zombie's work from the first movie. Apart from that, we've got the similar situation where at the end of the movie, he gets killed. Now, we can only assume that he died from his injuries at the end of Halloween 2 because there wasn't a Halloween 3. That probably wasn't because Michael died at the end. They probably would have brought him back if they could and they greenlit the project, but they didn't, so we can assume that he did die from his injuries at the end of Halloween 2. So the only big issue that I have with Halloween 2 in terms of Michael being human is he survived the gunshot to the face from the previous movie. We move on to David Gordon Green's Halloween from 2018. Again, they're trying to bring Michael back to this more human-like state because it is a direct sequel to the first movie. So Michael is still a human being in this timeline because he was a human being in the first movie. But this one is questionable because we are going with that timeline, but at the same time, he does get shot and stabbed multiple times in the movie. Are they wounds that you would die from? Possibly. You know, there's a scene in the film where he gets shot in the neck by Karen. You would most likely die from that if it hits an artery. He does get shot in the back of the chest by Laurie earlier on in the movie. He gets stabbed by Laurie a couple of times as well. But it's hard to tell, and I think that's what David Gordon Green was going for. He wanted to show Michael getting stabbed and shot to the point where a normal human would die, but at the same time, in the real world, you can survive from those. So it's hard to say with Halloween 2018. Yes, in the real world, you would most likely succumb to those injuries, but it's not impossible to survive from those. So with Halloween 2018, it is a questionable one. So I'm going to say it is quite realistic, and there's nothing in it that you definitely would die from. We move on to Halloween Kills from 2021. This is where it gets batshit crazy because Michael survives the end of Halloween 2018. I did mention that Halloween 2018, that he was kind of a human being. I didn't mention the burning at the end because we can only assume that he died from his injuries from the burning at the end of that movie. But we got a sequel, which means he survived the impossible. He didn't die in the burning house. So straight away, he survived something that he shouldn't have survived. Yes, they explained that he was hiding in that gun locker, but you would probably still die in that gun locker, unfortunately for Michael. He does get stabbed and shot a lot of times in this movie. We've even got a mob that shoot him from point blank range a couple of times. They stab him. Everything that happens to Michael, he should have died from those injuries from the mob. Even you've got Karen stabbing him at the back of the spine as well, really deep. He probably wouldn't be able to walk again if he survived those injuries. She even stabbed him with a pitchfork. He gets stomped on by Karen. It seems like Karen's given him the worst, but he gets stomped on by Karen as well, that you would just die from. So in Halloween Kills, out of all the movies in the franchise, I feel like Halloween Kills made Michael look the most inhuman out of the entire franchise. And that's quite ironic because David Gordon Green was still trying to go with that realistic Michael Myers, but it feels like he went a little bit too far this time. He might even try and argue that you can still survive from some of these wounds, and it's true if only one of those things happen to you. But if you accumulate all of those injuries into one, you're a goner. One other thing about Halloween Kills is I think it is the only movie in the franchise where Michael Myers doesn't die at the end, or it doesn't look like he's supposed to die at the end because he's standing at the window at the end of the movie. So there's no question that he's still alive at the end. Last up, we've got Halloween Ends from 2022. And ironically, going from Halloween Kills to Halloween Ends didn't make sense because Halloween Kills, Michael was this unstoppable force of nature who just couldn't die. Whereas in Halloween Ends, he was probably at his most realistic. He was over 60 years old. He was like 65 years old or whatever. And he acted like a 65-year-old man. He did have those injuries from Halloween Kills that he should have died from, but didn't. But if we start off afresh from Halloween Ends, he's got injuries and he acts like he has injuries. I feel like this is the most realistic Michael that we've had since Rob Zombie's Halloween in 2007, because Michael does act like he's injured. He doesn't get or sustain any injuries throughout the movie until the end. Corey does beat him up a little bit in the tunnel, in the sewer, which is realistic, so props to David Gordon Green for that. But at the end of the movie, when he was fighting against Laurie, yes, it's a realistic fight because it's two pensioners fighting against each other, but ultimately, when he started getting slashed and stabbed by Laurie, even getting slit in the throat, he was still moving around. So a normal man should have and would have died from those injuries. It shouldn't have taken him to bleed out for ages and ages for him to die. He should have died instantly from those injuries. So that kind of makes you question, and I think that was the intention of David Gordon Green. Is he a human? Is he not? Right up until the end of the movie. And of course, they had that junkyard scene where Michael gets thrown into the junk, into the mincer, and his body just gets disintegrated in that mincer. So he's definitely a human being because he dies at the end of the movie. However, the injuries he sustained in that kitchen are questionable. So that is all the injuries that Michael sustains that makes you question whether he's more than just a human being. And when I was going through the list watching the movies, I was actually thinking to myself, do you know what? Michael is more human than I initially thought. He doesn't sustain a whole lot that a human being couldn't survive. And that is quite surprising. When you look at characters like Jason Voorhees, he gets all sorts happen to him. Whereas when you look at Michael, although a lot does happen that you would question, it's not as much as I thought it was initially. But what about you guys? Do you think the things that I mentioned on this list a normal human could survive? Or is there anything that I didn't mention that you think a normal human wouldn't survive? Leave your comments and opinions down below. Let me know what you think, guys. And as always, thanks a lot for watching. Thanks for subscribing, and I'll see you soon.
I'll be right back.
What are you waiting for, huh?
Coming to get you, Barbara.
Ever played Skin the Cat?
Someone's in the back!